Hello, it's Rafael Gutierrez. Welcome to our channel. Today I'm going to talk about a special point that someone actually, his name is Mr. Thompson, asked about, which is a point right behind the ear here. Now, one of the things you notice is if you looked at the bubishi videos, I talked about a lot of different points and why they actually do work. Now, I've actually been seeing this over and over again. A lot of times people discount legends. They just assume they didn't happen because they don't understand how they happen. A lot of times people don't understand basic human biology and they try to force things together through what their experience. Now remember, one person's experience could actually have a lot to could give you a lot of information, but it's not as much as going through scientific data and looking at what actually occurs with everything and going to clinical records and finding out what happens and why. Now, the point he actually mentioned was, like I said, back in the back of the ear, and it's labeled as one of the forbidden points. And I get the feeling that I understand why it's considered a forbidden point. But to go into that, I actually do have to go into the skull, and I have a nice picture here, and this is actually the area that he's talking about hitting, which is a mastoid process. A lot of things online call it the mastoid bone. It's not the bone, it's a process. It's part of a bone, it's part of the temporal bone. Now, that we already talked about how there are certain areas of the temporal bone which when they break, they can affect arteries. The mastoid process, one of the problems that you actually have with it is it's really close to the ear. It is also filled with things called air cells, where it's pretty much you have bone and you have, sometimes it looks like a honeycomb underneath there. Now, I will say it still requires a lot of force to hit and break that. But if you do hit and break that, there's a whole mess of problems you could end up dealing with. One is you can actually make someone deaf, and that may actually sometimes occur even without the hit being that hard. It may cause temporary damage of the auditory nerve. It may actually cause permanent damage to the auditory nerve. But the thing is, yes, it can actually cause damage to the nerves. But there is something that is more problematic, which is probably the reason why most people would have called it a prohibited point. I can't remember the exact words, but a prohibited point that we'll use. The reason is this: inside that bone, even though it seems big and strong, it's actually filled with these honeycomb arrangement, which means a hard enough blow can actually break that bony projection. You can actually feel it behind the ear, and if that breaks, besides doing damage to the ear and auditory tube, a lot of times it can end up leading to infections, and one of the infections that happens here can end up going into the brain. Now, some of the things that I talked about, in a couple days you actually end up getting a relatively horrible death. When it comes to the mastoid process, one of the reasons that it probably is a forbidden point, that's what I meant, is because you're not dealing with something that you would use for self-defense, not necessarily. You hit that area, and if you know about that area, what you do is you actually end up causing, well, meningitis, which is a inflammation of the area inside the brain. Problem with meningitis, especially this case, is it's bacterial. Now, most people think viruses are more dangerous than bacteria. In the brain, viruses are self-limiting, so you need supportive care. You need to go to a doctor, make sure you're okay, and you need to follow directions to make sure it doesn't get worse. But bacterial meningitis ends up forming pus pockets. Today, even with today's medicine, we do have a lot of problems with pus pockets in the brain. It can cause irreversible problems. And so that's one of the big things that actually is worth looking at. If you're breaking the mastoid process, causing infections inside the brain, you're going to end up having major problems today. Now, let's take a point where surgery was pretty much at its infancy. Well, I mean, we could even go up to 200 years ago, where people were still doing some sorts of surgeries, but you didn't have necessarily the germ theory. As you actually broke that, you ended up getting an infection. Well, imagine someone going into your brain without the pretty much without the availability of antibiotics. First of all, they're going into your brain and trying to dig stuff out. Second thing is you don't have the antibiotics, so as they go into your brain, chances are they're going to bring in more infections. This wouldn't kill you really quickly. This would actually kill you in a matter of months or weeks after the initial weeks or month after the initial attack. You have to get the fracture, you get the bacterial infection, then you have to let the bacterial infection lead its course. So again, I can see why this would be a prohibited point or a restricted point, because you're talking about doing something that potentially could hurt someone for a long after the fight is done. Now, that said, I actually get the feeling that most of the bubishis and most of these points that were actually used weren't intended necessarily for people who were martial art, the layman, to use. I get the feeling that most of these points were actually used for people who were working with injured people to help them triage, and they would know this point we can help them live, but it might be time to let them know it's like, you don't have much time left, so start preparing your end. And it really would be something that for someone who works with injured soldiers would probably see a lot of this and probably would say, look, it's over. By the way, don't worry about getting this hit on someone else, because it's not going to help the battle. It's going to only cause more pain down the line. Now, there are some people who that's what they were probably after. Now, I am going to actually just talk a little bit about something else that I actually recently found. I don't know that a lot of people who watch this channel actually have a really high level of education, either by going to schooling or by teaching themselves. And one thing I would actually recommend is, if you have Netflix, check out the series by CNN. One of them is called the 80s, one of them is the 90s, one of them is the 70s. Because a lot of times we tend to talk and worry about how horrible things are going, but we don't look at the previous last 10 years to see how things actually were. We tend to deal with what we perceive our idea of how great things were in the past. And what's funny is, when I actually watched that, I always say that things are always getting better. Sometimes we have swings backwards, sometimes we have swings forward, but in the long term, we actually can see things progressively get better. Now, I would tell people to watch those, and actually watch them backwards. So start with the 90s, then go to the 80s, and go to the 70s. Because what you'll notice is things that people worried about back then really didn't do anything. I mean, you had a lot of people saying, "Oh, it's the end of the world. Look at how perverse we've become." And at the end of the day, it didn't do anything. Actually, quite the contrary. We actually got better. Our lives got better as we moved on. Now, people will say yes, but in how much better? Well, yes, you will see that there is a difference in the extreme rich and middle class. Our middle class really isn't getting as much in finance as the richer of the rich. But at the same time, we actually have the ability to do different things that we didn't before. And before, I know there are some people who no, things only get worse. I would tell you to watch those, and like I said, watch them backwards so you can see how bad it was in the 90s, how bad it was in the 80s, how bad it was in the 70s. And what people actually considered pretty much the okay behavior back then, and how it's changed. I think most people, once you watch that, you will almost be grateful that you live in the time period you do, especially if you live in Europe or the Americas. Well, there are a lot of other things I do want to talk about, but I figure I'll save it for next time. I hope you enjoyed this, and have a nice day.